Hi there, and welcome to Lecture Series 12 for my Introduction to Psychology course. This section is going to focus on remembering and forgetting, issues that are very relevant to students. During the whole lecture of Unit 12, we'll talk about different measures of memory, we'll talk about why we forget things, and we'll talk about false memories, or memories we're sure are real but aren't. So, how do people measure memory? Well, students know this very well because their professors subject them to memory measures all the time. So the first measure of memory I'd like to tell you about is recognition. That is the ability to notice or identify something as old or previously seen or heard. The classic way to measure recognition memory is with multiple choice tasks. Students get those all the time. So if I ask you, what's the capital of France? That's a measure of your ability to recognize the right answer as Paris. You may go through an old yearbook and look at someone's face and say, I recognize the face. Now what's the name that goes with that face? Well, recognition is one thing, recall is another. And recall is the effortful retrieval of information. So you can't just recognize it as something that you have encountered before. You have to be able to pull that information out of your brain. So fill in the blank, essay tests, those all measure recall memory. So if I ask you, the capital of France is... filling in Paris would be a recall measure. Showing you pictures from your yearbook and asking you to recall the names of the individuals, that would be a recall measure. Now, how do recall and recognition work relative to each other? Well, ask any student if they'd prefer to take an essay test or a multiple choice test, and you'll get your answer there. So recognition memory lasts longer than recall memory. And we know this from a great study back in the 70s, where a researcher studied memory for names and faces from the yearbooks of each of the participants. So it was both recall measures and recognition measures of folks in each person's yearbook. And the amazing thing about this study is they went almost 50 years back. So they had some of their subjects look at high school yearbooks that were 50 years old. So we're talking about participants who would have been, 68, 69, 70 years old, something like that. And I want you to look at this graph that's up here now. On the vertical axis is percent correct, so 100% is the top. And on the horizontal axis is the number of years since the person graduated from high school. And what you can see is that recognition memory, either recognizing the face or recognizing the name, that stays really high. In fact, if you go out over 47 years, people can still recognize over 80% of the people in their high school yearbook. That's impressive. But how about recall? Well, when you can recognize 80% of the people in your yearbook, you can only recall them about 30. You can only recall about 30% of them. So recognition memory hangs on longer and in many ways is easier than recall memory. But those aren't the only two measures of memory. Relearning is another measure of memory. So let's say that you learn how to ride a bicycle, but then you don't ride a bicycle for 10 years. When you get back on the bicycle after a 10-year or 20-year break, it may take you a second or two to get familiar with riding a bike again, but then you're off. So how quickly you can relearn something is a measure of how much you learned from the first time around. So for example, if you already learned how to speak Spanish, but then you didn't speak Spanish for 20 years, and then now you try to speak Spanish again, you can relearn Spanish much more quickly the second time than you could the first time. So relearning is a measure of memory, and so is something called priming. Now, priming is a measure that's used, it's also a phenomenon, but is something that's used to tap unconscious memories. So before I say anything more about that, look at this chart right here. And you see on the bottom left this green circle or green square. Would you just join me in reading the words there? So red, blue, orange, yellow, green, right? I immediately fill in the word stem completion, the bottom unit, as green. Obvious, right? Well, let's go over to the other side of the slide and look at the blue box and just read those words. Plum, nectarine, pear, apple, grape. Obviously, it's grape. But before, obviously, it was green. Reading a bunch of color words primes me to pick a color word to fill in the blank in the first example, and reading the names of fruits primes me to pick a fruit to fill in the same example in the other case. If I show you a picture of a rabbit and then ask you to spell the word hare, you might spell the word H-A-R-E. But if I showed you a wig before I asked you to spell the word hair, you'd probably spell H-A-I-R, right? So priming is an unconscious memory, an implicit memory, and it's said to occur anytime your current behavior is influenced by something that you've seen or done or heard or participated in the past. Now, there's all sorts of priming, and in fact, students can take advantage of priming to improve their scores on exams. So it turns out that our memory is dependent on a lot of different things. And by that I mean, when you learn something, you don't just learn the fact or the story itself, you learn the context, the larger context in which that fact or story was presented. So if you learn something in a particular classroom while sitting in a particular seat, your memory for that thing is going to be best when you are in the same physical location. In fact, if you go to medical school or law school, you'll see students actually studying in the same seat that they plan to take a test in. They're trying to take advantage of priming by location. Priming by location, I've got some data here that actually come from studies funded by the Navy. In the Navy, there's a group of people called Navy SEALs, and they are taught to do various things, usually in or under the water. And here was a question that the Navy wanted to know. If you're going to train a Navy SEAL to do something under the water, where should you teach them that thing? On land or underwater? Now, if you look at this graph on the left-hand side of the slide, you'll see 4 different conditions. And they're created by doing a 2x2 design. So either you learn something on land or in water, and you were tested on that thing on land or in water. So in half the cases, people are learning and testing is the same. So either you could learn underwater and be tested underwater, or learn on land and be tested on land. And then there's 2 conditions where there's a mismatch, where people are learning on underwater but being tested on land, or learning on land and being tested underwater. And what I want you to see is that the right half of the graph, the bars are higher than on the left half of the graph. What does that mean? It means that when the learning condition and the test condition are the same, people remember more. But when there's a mismatch, when where you learn something is different from where you have to recall it or recognize it, your memory is lower. That supports the idea of priming by location. It's not something people are aware of, but it still happens. There's also priming by mood. It turns out that if you are in a bad mood, let's say you're really sad and depressed, that's going to prime your recall of sad and depressed memories. So, one of the things that's sort of a bummer about being depressed is once you're depressed, it makes you recall more depressed memories, which makes you more depressed, which makes you, there's this downward spiral. And there can also be an upward spiral. But if you are in a really good mood when you learn something, then get yourself back in that really good mood when you're going to be tested on it. Okay, deja vu. Have you ever had the experience of walking into a room or maybe a new place you've never been before, and all of a sudden, mysteriously, you get this feeling that you've been there before or that this has happened before? Have you ever had that? It's called Deja vu. It's French for already seen, right? It's like, oh, I've been here before. Now you know that you have physically never been there before, at least not in your conscious awareness, but it sure feels that way. How do you explain that? Well, a lot of people explain it by falling back onto very sort of extraterrestrial or extrasensory experiences. But psychologists understand deja vu in terms of priming. And the idea is that you haven't been in that particular situation before, but you have been in a lot of situations like that maybe has a number of different characteristics and that are the same as past experiences. And it's that priming that gives rise to the deja vu. That's the explanation that psychologists give. When we get towards the end of the class, we're going to take everything we've learned this semester and then focus on mental illnesses, challenges that people face, and the treatments for them. And one kind of mental illness that's getting more and more attention is PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. It's a disorder of recovery. PTSD occurs typically 6 months after a major trauma. And what happens with people who are struggling with PTSD is they can't stop the memories from intrusively invading their awareness. So maybe a soldier is in a grocery store putting groceries in the back of the car, and a car backfires. It makes a small explosion sound. And that explosion, or the backfiring sound, is enough to trigger a flood of memories related to situations where explosions meant someone was trying to kill you, right? Actually, we have a cat who I think was traumatized before we adopted her. If you pick up your hand or take an aggressive step, she's completely traumatized. So PTSD is associated with this, your brain getting stuck thinking you're still in the dangerous situation when actually now you're in a safe situation. Folks with PTSD are especially susceptible to priming. Any stimulus that's related to the event of their trauma, whether it was a war or military service or maybe physical abuse or mental abuse, anything that was related to their experiences is a very powerful trigger for them to relive all those old feelings and sights and sounds and all of that. That's it for the first segment of Lecture 12. Come right back and we'll move on to the next bit. You'll love it.